There is a moment, not marked by words, nor goodbyes, but by the sudden stillness in their gaze. You were still speaking, still hoping, still reaching, but their soul had already turned its face away. It wasn't the end that broke you. It was that breathless, invisible instant when you felt them leave your emotional orbit while sitting right beside you. You smiled, and they didn't look up. You cried, and they didn't ask why. Your light dimmed, and they didn't even notice. This isn't just heartbreak. This is existential dislocation, a psychic silence so loud that it dismantles your very sense of being real. Carl Jung called this abandonment of the soul, the moment when the mirror of the other refuses to reflect you. Gregg Braden's research shows how the heart's coherence, the alignment of your emotional and electromagnetic truth, shatters when connection disappears. Not just biologically, spiritually, symbolically. This video is not about their departure. It's about what disappeared inside you when you were no longer seen. Not because you stopped existing, but because you stopped being witnessed. You're not haunted by them. You're haunted by the moment your soul stopped being mirrored. Let us begin. Let us return to that moment, not to suffer, but to retrieve what was left behind. It wasn't when they left that something inside you collapsed. It was before, quietly, in the way they stopped reaching for your hand. In the way their laughter no longer echoed after your words. There's a kind of grief that arrives without announcement, when you're still in the room, still in the story, but no longer in their emotional gaze. This is the invisible wound, a psychic fracture that occurs when the soul is left unattended while the body remains close. You kept showing up, heart open, gaze soft, but something in them had already turned away. And yet, they didn't go. They stayed long enough for your spirit to hope, long enough for your soul to doubt itself. Jung taught that we become real in the eyes of the other, that our emotional reality is affirmed through reflection. But when the mirror goes dim, when their energy no longer meets yours, your psyche doesn't just feel sadness, it questions its own existence. That moment wasn't about losing them, it was about losing your sense of being chosen. And beneath this heartbreak is the reactivation of a deeper pain, childhood echoes, moments when you cried and no one came, when your joy was invisible, when your truth went unanswered. To be unseen while present is to relive the ancient ache of not being mirrored when your soul most needed it. This is why it hurts so deeply, because it's not only about now, it's about every time before when you were there and no one came closer. There's a quiet cruelty hidden beneath some spiritual teachings, not in their essence, but in how they echo inside a wounded heart. You attract what you are. How many nights did that phrase haunt you? How often did you wonder, was I so unworthy, so fragmented that even their silence was something I called in? But Jung would gently respond, no, you didn't become invisible. You were simply no longer seen because they could no longer hold the depth you were becoming. You didn't lose them because your energy was flawed. You lost their reflection because your soul began to speak a language they weren't ready to understand. This was not about attraction, it was about attunement. In Jungian language, the sacred psychic bond, the shared mirror of two souls, requires mutual presence. When one stops reflecting, the other begins to vanish. The pain didn't come from lack. It came from the sacred space between you collapsing, the space where your essence once echoed in theirs. The shame you carry, that maybe your love was too much or your truth too heavy, is not yours to hold. Your light didn't disappear. It was simply not met. Gregg Braden reminds us, coherence is not just connection, it is alignment between truth and reflection. When the mirror turns away, it's not a judgment, it's a sign that your depth outgrew the surface it once danced with. And so, let this not be an indictment of your energy. Let it be a liberation, not from them, but from the illusion that you needed to shrink to remain visible. What if the heartbreak wasn't about rejection, but about your light no longer fitting into their shadow? There is a silent moment in many soul journeys when one heart begins to awaken while the other chooses comfort over depth. Perhaps they didn't stop loving you. Perhaps they loved the version of you who didn't yet shine so brightly, who hadn't yet remembered her truth. As your soul began to unfurl, as you stopped apologizing for your depth, as your wounds turned into words and your silence into clarity, something in them recoiled. Not because you were wrong, but because they were not ready to witness someone remembering who they are. Jung would say, the emergence of the self often threatens the constructs around us. When you begin to embody your archetypal truth, those still asleep will often look away. Your invisibility may have coincided not with the loss of their love, but with the rise of your essence, and they couldn't follow. This is the deeper grief, not just being left, but being abandoned at the exact moment you became more yourself. Gregg Braden speaks of resonance, that as your frequency shifts, so does the reality around you. And sometimes, those closest to your heart can no longer stand in the field you now inhabit. You are not mourning just them. You are mourning the version of you who thought you had to stay small to be held. After such a wound, something in you learns to dim before the light has a chance to shine. Not out of fear of love, but of love's vanishing. The very parts of you that once shimmered, your spontaneous laughter, your dreams spoken aloud, your instinctive reaching toward connection, have become ghosts you now guard in silence. You don't enter rooms with your full self anymore. You scan for safety. You measure your joy, fearing that its fullness will once again go unseen. This isn't just emotional, it's biological. Gregg Braden reminds us that the heart, when wounded, loses its coherence, and the body begins to believe that visibility equals danger. So you hide your radiance not because you don't want to be loved, but because being loved and then forgotten felt like a psychic collapse you're not sure you could survive again. In Jungian terms, this is the exile of the inner child, the silencing of the one who danced without fear, who spoke before she questioned whether her words had a place. The soul begins to believe that being seen leads to disappearance. So it chooses invisibility, thinking it is safer than exposure without response. But the cost is heavy, because the parts of you silence are the very fragments that once lit the world around you, and now they flicker only in dreams. Imagine a woman standing in a room flooded with golden light. She is still, she is luminous, and yet no one looks. Their eyes move past her, as if her presence no longer bends the air, as if her soul, once reflected in their gaze, has dissolved into something unseen. She begins to fade. Not because her light diminished, but because the gaze that once confirmed her existence has turned elsewhere. This is not imagination, this is archetype. Jung taught that we exist symbolically through the eyes of the other, not just in physical presence, but in the mirroring of our essence. When that mirror fractures, when your soul speaks and no one listens, your psyche begins to question, am I still real? Or did I vanish the moment they stopped seeing me? The disappearing woman is not a fantasy. She is a psychic reality for every soul who has ever been fully present while slowly becoming invisible in the heart of someone who once called them home. It is a deep, existential loneliness. To be in the light, but feel as though you no longer cast a shadow. Gregg Braden's work reminds us that energy responds to connection, and when that connection dissolves, the very field around us can feel as though it's collapsing. But this fading is not the end. It is a symbol, a message. An echo asking not to be rescued, but to be remembered. There's a scene you keep returning to, not because you want to, but because something in it never closed. The way they looked away, the pause in their breath, the subtle shift in their energy, so quiet, yet so final. It plays in your mind like a dream that forgot how to end. This isn't nostalgia. It's not longing. It's a soul echo. An inner fragment caught in time, repeating itself not to torment you, but to call you back. In Jungian thought, repetition is never accidental. What returns again and again is what the unconscious cannot release until it is seen, held, named. You're not haunted by them, you're haunted by the part of you that became untethered in that exact moment. Gregg Braden's vision of the heart's intelligence mirrors this beautifully. The heart remembers. It records emotion in waves, and when coherence breaks, the imprint lingers until harmony can be restored. That memory is not your enemy. It is your soul's compass. It keeps returning because something sacred was lost in the silence and is still waiting to be reclaimed. Until you walk back to that version of yourself, the one left standing in the emotional doorway, the memory will not rest, because it was never just about them. It was about who you were becoming when no one stayed to witness it. Did you enjoy the content and it made a difference for you? Click on Super Thanks and support our work. She remembers the moment with the clarity of a wound. They were sitting side by side. She spoke, softly, vulnerably, and he said nothing. He didn't ask about the tears in her eyes. He didn't reach for her trembling hand. That night, something inside her closed like a forgotten door. Not out of anger, but out of sorrow so deep, it echoed in silence. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She simply disappeared inward. For a long time, she believed that invisibility was her new name, that to be untouched was to be unworthy. And yet, months later, without permission or plan, she began writing again, not to him, but to the woman she was before the silence, before she became ghost-like in the presence of another. She wrote letters to the version of herself that used to feel real in her own skin, to the woman who once danced without waiting to be seen. She didn't need him to look back. She needed to return her own gaze to the soul that had been waiting in the shadows. Her healing did not come from understanding his silence, but from no longer silencing herself. Jung would say, we find the lost parts of ourselves by turning toward the unconscious, not outward, but inward, to where the forgotten fragments wait for integration. She stopped asking why he stopped looking, and instead began to ask, why did I stop seeing myself as someone worth being seen? That question didn't bring her back to him. It brought her home. The gaze that wounded you cannot be the gaze that heals you. There comes a sacred turning point, not in their return, but in your remembrance. The soul that once trembled in the corner of someone else's silence begins to rise again, not because it is invited back, but because it no longer seeks invitation. Visibility does not begin in the eyes of another. It begins in the moment you say, I still exist, even here, even now, even without their reflection. Jung taught that healing happens when the unconscious becomes conscious, when the exiled part of the self is brought back into the light of awareness, not to fix, not to perform, but simply to be. Gregg Braden's heart wisdom whispers that your electromagnetic field never stopped speaking. Your energy was real, even when they turned away. The soul's return is not a grand arrival. It is a quiet noticing, a breath, a recognition in the mirror. She's still here, the one who was silenced, the one who was unseen. She never left. Invisibility was never your essence. It was the blindness of the mirror. Now you no longer wait to be seen. You see yourself not as broken, but as sacred, not as forgotten, but as returning. You were never truly haunted by them. You were haunted by the moment your emotional truth was no longer reflected in their eyes, by the silence that arrived not with their absence, but with the disappearance of recognition. That version of you, the one who looked up and found no gaze waiting, didn't vanish. She was displaced, unmirrored, suspended in a space where the soul asks, do I still matter if no one sees me? Gregg Braden reminds us, the heart's field extends far beyond the body. Your energy is not imagination, it is memory, it is presence, it is real. Carl Jung would say, what you cannot integrate becomes shadow. And that moment, the one you revisit in dreams, in pauses, in echoes, is not asking to be erased. It is asking to be remembered, reclaimed, re-seen. Visibility does not return through the gaze of those who once looked away. It returns when you meet your own soul and say, without trembling, "I see you, I never stopped." If you made it this far, comment with the words that awaken this sacred belonging. Estoy despierta. Your soul has always been visible. Now it is simply being remembered.